I'm going to show you the 3 most common mistakes a lot of game devs make, what they are, what do they mean, and how to trace them back and how to understand them, which will help you solve them every single time you have them in your project, and you will be able to easier debug any bug that is similar to this one. So first, I'm going to hit the play button, show you that over here in the console right away we have a null reference exception. This is the first one that we are going to deal with. So what is null reference exception? Of course, if you double click here on the error inside the console and go in the code, you will see that this line 12 here, player transform positions equal to new vector 3, is the one causing this problem. And what does it mean, null reference exception? Well, this goes back to our C# lessons about classes and objects. If you didn't watch that, you have it on my YouTube channel. You also have it in the Game Dev Pro amongst a bunch of other lessons. But this essentially means that we have a player object, which is this one over here, and he is not pointing to anything. What does that mean? Well, the equal sign is not set on him. So whenever you see a null reference exception, know that for the variable that you are using, you did not set to be equal to anything. Now, of course, in this case, there are multiple things that you can do. You can say something like player is equal to game object. That will fix the issue. Or you can even say player is equal to game object find with tag. So let me just type it out, game object. If I can type it with capital G, hopefully, there you go. Find with tag, and here you pass the tag and then you will get that game object. But what's important in these lines of code is this right over here. So the equal sign. Now the equal sign will make it point to something, because if you remember, when we talked about classes and objects, when we create an object, it is a reference that is pointing to a spot in memory. Now, if you don't add the equal sign, this pointing does not happen, and thus you see null reference exception, meaning this object is not referencing anything. And it's not only about game objects. It can happen to rigid bodies, it can happen to any type of component that you have, your custom classes that you create. But the important thing is when you see this error, so when you see this right here, null reference exception, immediately know that this error occurred because the object you are using on the specific line, in this case it's line 12, which is this one over here. Of course, we saved the script with these 2 lines, but what's important, that object that you're using, in this case the object player, you did not set it to be equal to anything. So it's not pointing to anything, it's empty on its own, and thus you have the null reference exception. And now every single time you stumble upon this type of error, think of it that way. So think of it that the object you're using, it's simply not pointing to anything. It's not set, its equal sign is not set to be equal to anything. And that will be much easier for you to first understand what's going on, and second, to find the bug and eliminate it in your code. The second most common mistake I see game developers make is when it comes to collision detection. So over here, I have a simple scene with an enemy and a player. These are assets from my Game Dev Pro. You can check it out, link is down below. And I want to detect collision when the enemy collides with the player. And I want to print that out in the console. So if I hit the play button, let's see what's going to happen. The enemy landed on the player and nothing happened. So what is wrong? What is going on over here? Well, the first thing that can happen when it comes to collision detection is that you misspelled the tags. So over here, I have the enemy tag with I at the end, but if I go here in the code and select the enemy, you will notice here that he has a tag with enemy Y, so Y at the end. So make sure that the tags are the first one that you check and see if everything is okay. As you can see, nothing is working, especially over here because we're using compare tag. This will not throw a null reference exception because we are comparing the tags. And over here, you will see that everything is hard-coded, but you will not hard-code it in your code. You will use a tag manager class to hold all of these tags like I do in Game Dev Pro. You probably saw that if you're there. Now, as you saw, I misspelled the tag. So you need to make sure that the capitalization and everything, so every single letter that you have over here, so E-N-E-M-Y, needs to match up with the one that you write here. So it's not I at the end, it needs to be Y at the end. So this is the first thing, the most common mistake that happens. Now, if I go back now over here and if I hit the play button, you will notice what? Now we should see in the console being printed, but nothing is being printed. What is the issue here? Well, the issue here, and this is the second most common thing that happens in concerning the collision detection issue, and this is the misspelling of the function that you want. So over here, as you can see, I used on trigger enter, but enter with E lowercase. It needs to be like this. So these functions that we inherit, and if you don't know what is inheritance, I have that in the C# videos over here on YouTube or in more detail on my or inside my Game Dev Pro, link is down below. Now over here, as you can see, on trigger enter, it needs to be capital O, capital T, capital E, Y. And over here, 2D, D is capital. Why it needs to be like that? Because this is how this function is defined in mono behavior or whatever class where it is defined that is in the hierarchy of the inheritance of mono behavior. Because you cannot, if you type over here on trigger enter, it is going to count this function as your own function that you declared in the test class, in our case over here, and it's not going to be the one that's inherited from mono behavior and that will be triggered automatically by the Unity system. So the second thing when it comes to collision, you need to make sure that over here the spelling is correct. Otherwise, it will not work. So now everything is in place, and if I go back and hit the play button, finally we should see that on or the collision is being printed. But again, it's not printed. What is wrong? Well, the third thing when it comes to collisions that a lot of people make mistake is there are two types of collisions that you can detect in your code. There is a trigger collision and there is a collision. What does that mean? That means over here we're testing on trigger enter 2D. So if you are testing a trigger, you need to make sure that at least one of the two objects that are supposed to collide, in this case, one is the enemy, the second one is the player. So at least one of them needs to have his collider set to be a trigger. In this case, I can select the enemy, and over here, you will notice that inside of his capsule collision or collider 2D, is trigger checkbox is not checked. So when I check the is trigger checkbox, and if I hit the play button, now the enemy will fall through the player because he's not solid, he's a trigger, but also over here you will see in the console collided with enemies being printed. So finally we are detecting this collision with the on trigger enter. This is another thing that you need to pay attention to when it comes to collisions. So do you want your game object to be a solid entity, a solid object that does not allow other objects to pass through it in the game? Or do you want it to be a trigger and other objects will pass through it? This is one thing that you need to decide, and based on that, you will use either on trigger enter or the other function. So if I go back here, I'm going to select the enemy and uncheck this on trigger enter. And what I'm going to do is go back and simply copy all of this and paste it here. And instead of on trigger, this one is going to be collision. And over here, instead of the collider as a parameter, it's going to be collision. And instead of other dot compare tag, is going to be other game object dot compare tag collided with enemy in collision. And over here, collided with enemy in trigger. And there you go. So if the object is solid, the collision or the collider is a solid body, then you're going to use on collision enter, 2D or 3D depending on your game. So if I go back over here and if I hit the play button, now we're going to see something different. Now we're going to see that the enemy lands on the player, but still we see collided with enemy in collision now is printed. And whatever this is, I have some issues with my functions or with my Visual Studio. Anyways, doesn't matter. But the important thing is that this works and we can check it out. So if I go back over here, you will notice that this is the line of code that's being triggered, which means inside of collision. And also you will notice one more thing, that the enemy is standing now on top of the player's head, as opposed to the previous example where it simply fell through the player head and then fell completely out of the level. So this is the difference, and these are the points that you need to pay attention to when the collision in your code does not work. And no matter what happens, no matter what the situation in your game is, if the collision does not work, one of those three things is the issue why it doesn't work. And of course, everything we talked about when it comes to tags and function correct spelling applies to onCollision enter and onTrigger enter. So these two apply to the same, to both of these functions. So you need to make sure that the tag is okay, that you spelled the onCollision or the collision function name correctly, or if you're using and testing the correct collision. So that also needs to be checked. These three things are the main things. And no matter, I did not encounter any situation when it comes to the collision, where the collision did not work, where one of these cases was not the problem. So there you go. Now, every single time your collision does not work, you know exactly where to look and how to solve it. And the third common thing that happens a lot with a lot of game developers is, again, connected to null reference exception. And let me just explain the scenario. So over here, I have a script, the shooter one, and the shooter is supposed to shoot anywhere where I press on the screen. So when I press, nothing happens. I have a null reference exception. Now, if I click here to go in the code, we will notice that over here, this is the code, or this is causing the problem. So bullet pull, get the bullet, and it's not returning. So over here we have null. So what's happening? So what I'm going to do is go to the implementation of this function. And over here, I am supposed to see that we should get the bullet from the bullet pull. And this is, by the way, one of the classes from my Game Dev Pro, where I talk about bullet pulling. And over here, we should return a bullet, but as you can see, we have a null reference exception. Now, you might think that you did not set the bullets over here. You set it equal to be null, and that is the problem, and yada, yada, yada. But one important thing to think about when it comes to null reference exception and these things happening is if you're using prefabs. So if you're using prefabs, or if you're using game objects that you need to attach, it can happen that they are not attached. So if I again hit the play button and shoot, and let me just go here in the perpetrator, this is the problem. So the bullet pull. So over here, we need to have a reference to the bullet pull. And in this case, we're not setting the bullet pull to be equal to null or calling bullet pull equals to nowhere in the code. Why? Well, because over here, if I go, we select the shooter. Notice over here, the none is for the bullet pull set. So that means we didn't drag the bullet pull over here. Now this can be referring to a prefab, it can be referring to a game object like here that you see, but more often than not, this will refer to a prefab where you need to attach a prefab. So when the null reference exception happens, it's not only about that you did not set equal sign on the game object. It can happen that you did not attach a prefab at the appropriate place. So another thing that you should connect with the null reference exception, now that you know what is null reference exception and how it works and why it happens, you also need to think about, are you using a prefab? Are you using a game object that you need to attach or even load from your resources and you did not do that? So if the first thing that we talked in the first part of this video, where you did not set equals on the game object, if that is not what you're doing, then you should be looking at, did you attach the appropriate game object? So now when I attach the bullet pull, if I go here, hit the play button, we should see that the bullets are swarming everywhere over here, and that is how it is supposed to be. So there you go. There are two things connected with null reference exception, and I purposely left this one last because first I have explained what is null reference exception, then I show you what is or how other scenarios can affect that null reference exception. Anyways, these are the three most common mistakes I have seen over the 8 years in the game dev industry, and a lot of people asking me, what is this, why it's happening, and so on and so forth. Hope that this will debunk the mystery. Now you will know what's a null reference exception, how to solve it, and all of the bugs relating to it are going to be a piece of cake right now. And also regarding the collision thing, also happens a lot, so you will be able to solve it with, either isolating one of the three problems that I showed you. Anyways, if you want to find out more and see more of these things, you will find them in the Game Dev Pro. Link is down below. And I have a cool bonus where you get a live call with me, 1 hour live call every month that will skyrocket your game dev career, and you can read the reviews about that on the page. So just click it, check it out, like, share, subscribe, whatnot, and that will be it. I will see you guys in the next video.